A black woman, the CEO of a major airline, boards her own flight and settles into first class, looking forward to a rare moment of peace. But as the flight begins, a flight attendant denies her headphones, claiming they're only for first-class passengers. What happens next is nothing short of extraordinary. Within minutes, the CEO makes a call by the time the plane lands. The entire crew is dismissed. This wasn't just about headphones. It was about power, respect, and a reminder that discrimination doesn't always recognize who it's targeting. Stay tuned, because this story will leave you speechless. Before we get started, let us know where you're watching from. And if this resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind everyday moments. The airport, like the country it inhabited, was a symphony of motion, but not always harmony. It moved with the same contradictions as the world outside its glass walls, orderly on the surface, yet teeming with silent skirmishes underneath. Sophia Carter walked through this space as she always did, with the bearing of someone who understood exactly how much room she was allowed to take up. Her long coat trailed behind her like a flag, but she held no illusions that anyone would salute it. She wasn't just a passenger. She owned the very airline that thousands of travelers crisscrossed the skies on each day. Her fingerprints were on the logos pressed into the leather headrests, the menus curated to perfection, even the scent of lavender that drifted faintly through the first-class cabin. Yet none of this would save her from the unspoken protocols that governed spaces she was never supposed to inhabit. As she approached the first-class lounge, her heels tapped out a rhythm against the polished tile floor, a cadence that commanded respect without requesting it. The lounge door opened with a soft sigh, but the woman standing behind the counter did not. Jessica was young, white, and carried the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned her place behind that counter. Her blonde ponytail swung gently as she glanced at Sophia's boarding pass. It was the barest of acknowledgments, barely a glance, just enough to confirm Sophia's presence, but not her personhood. "First class is straight ahead," Jessica said, waving her through with a flick of the wrist, as though Sophia were being allowed entry, not claiming her rightful space. Sophia felt it, the hesitation, that pause half a second too long. It wasn't a snub loud enough to raise a fuss over. It rarely was. That was the nature of it, wasn't it? These weren't the bombastic scenes people imagined when they spoke of racism. No, this was quieter, sharper, and far more exhausting. Sophia didn't bother to return the polite pleasantry Jessica clearly hadn't felt compelled to offer. She stepped into the lounge, letting the door hiss shut behind her. The room hummed softly with the wealth of its occupants. Leather seats cradled men in expensive suits, their watches glinting under the low, golden light. A soft-spoken pianist filled the air with music that tiptoed around conversations about mergers and market shares. Sophia selected a corner seat, one that let her observe without being observed too easily. She placed her leather tote beside her, pulling out the novel she had meant to finish. But her eyes flicked up, often habitual, instinctual. She had learned a long time ago to stay alert in rooms like this. It wasn't long before she felt it again. The eyes. Not all of them. Most passengers paid her no mind. But one pair lingered. A man seated near the bar, his glass of whiskey half raised. His gaze wasn't curious, it was questioning. As if he were trying to work out how she had gotten here. As if there had been a mistake. Sophia held his gaze for just a breath longer than necessary. She had learned that trick. 2. The unblinking stare that made men like him shift in their seats reminded them she wasn't going anywhere. The bartender, an older black man with silver threading through his hair, caught her eye and offered the smallest nod. She returned it with a soft smile. When the flight was called, Sophia rose smoothly, gathering her belongings as effortlessly as she gathered the stray glances that trailed after her. At the gate, the young man who scanned her boarding pass hesitated just as Jessica had. His uniform was neat, his posture formal, but his eyes betrayed him. The flicker of doubt, small but noticeable, crossed his face when he saw the first-class indicator on her pass. "Right this way, ma'am," he said. It was polite, almost courteous, but the mask of professionalism didn't hide the disbelief well enough. Sophia stepped forward, her chin lifting slightly. She had lived in America long enough to recognize disbelief as an old companion. Inside the cabin, the luxury unfolded in a cascade of soft fabrics. gleaming surfaces, and hushed voices. Sophia found her seat by the window. The one she had chosen months ago when the flight had been booked. She barely settled in before Karen arrived. The blonde flight attendant had the brittle cheerfulness of someone who could perform kindness but didn't necessarily possess it. Karen's smile flickered over Sophia and faltered. But she caught herself in time. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked. "Water," Sophia replied. Karen nodded curtly and disappeared. Sophia wasn't naive. She had long understood that wealth did not shield her from these things, it merely changed the setting. It elevated the stage but left the script unchanged. She adjusted her scarf, gazing out at the tarmac below. A sea of ground crew bustled under the plane's wings, their neon vests flashing against the concrete. And then Karen returned. This time, she carried a tray of headphones, passing them to the first-class passengers. When she reached Sophia's row, her hands hesitated. Sophia saw it before Karen spoke. "Those are reserved for first-class passengers," Karen said, her voice carefully measured. Sophia's eyes didn't waver. "I am in first class." Karen's gaze flicked down to the seat. "Oh," she said, but the word felt anything but apologetic. She didn't hand over the headphones. Instead, she turned to the next row, her heels clicking sharply against the carpet. Sophia exhaled slowly. Not today, she thought. Today, she would not let it slide. The engines hummed low and steady, a soft vibration beneath Sophia's feet. The cabin lights had dimmed just enough to cast the space in a comfortable half-shadow. Outside, the world slipped away, but inside, the theater of small indignities was still in session. Sophia leaned back into the plush leather seat, one hand resting lightly on the novel she hadn't read past the first page. Her eyes were fixed not on the words, but on the aisle ahead. She had learned long ago to pay attention not to the things people said, but to the things they left unsaid. Karen returned. The flight attendant moved through the rows with mechanical precision, dispensing small comforts, pillows, blankets, drinks. Her posture softened as she greeted certain passengers, offering warm smiles and light laughter. But when she reached Sophia's row, the warmth cooled. Karen leaned forward, placing a glass of water on Sophia's tray table. The glass met the surface with just a touch too much force. A thin line of water rippled over the rim and pooled onto the polished tray. "There you go," Karen said, her tone clipped. Sophia met her gaze. She held it there, not as a challenge but as an acknowledgement. "I see you." "Thank you," Sophia said, her voice smooth, controlled. Karen lingered for a moment longer, her lips pressing into a thin line before she turned and moved on. Sophia's fingers traced the base of the glass, wiping away the small spill with the edge of her napkin. She recognized the gesture for what it was: small, precise, designed to chip away at the edges of her dignity. This was how it always began. The flight carried on. Passengers leaned into their reclining seats, blankets pulled to their chins, cocooned in the comfort that first class promised. The soft hum of engines filled the silence, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of a newspaper or the clink of ice swirling in a tumbler. Karen's footsteps were a faint drumbeat against the carpeted aisle, steady and deliberate, until she returned with a tray of headphones. Sophia watched as Karen handed out pairs to the passengers around her. One by one, the elderly white man across the aisle received his with a polite smile. A younger couple 2 rows ahead accepted theirs without a second glance. And then Karen stopped at Sophia's row. Her hand hovered over the cart as if debating something, as if she were weighing the cost of whatever came next. Sophia didn't move. She waited. "Excuse me," Sophia said finally, her voice soft but cutting through the air like a knife through silk. "Could I have my headphones, please?" Karen straightened, her face carefully neutral. "I'm sorry," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "We must have run out." Sophia's eyes flicked to the cart. There were at least 6 pairs still sitting there, nestled in neat rows. "Run out?" Sophia repeated, tilting her head slightly. Karen's lips curled into something that resembled a smile but held none of its warmth. "Yes," Karen replied. "Those are reserved for passengers who pre-requested them. It's standard policy." The lie sat between them, heavy and undeniable. Sophia didn't flinch. She simply shifted her gaze to the man across the aisle. He was watching the exchange now, his brow furrowed. "I didn't pre-request mine," he said, his voice breaking the tense silence. And I still got a pair. Karen stiffened. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Well, she stammered. That's different. Is it? The man pressed. Leaning forward slightly. Karen's eyes darted to Sophia. Then back to the man. It's company policy. Karen repeated, her voice tight, each word sharpened like a blade. Sophia felt the weight of every eye in the cabin shift toward her. But she remained still. She wasn't interested in being the center of a scene, not today. But she also wasn't interested in playing small to make Karen more comfortable. I wasn't aware that standard policy excluded certain passengers, Sophia said, her tone calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to her words. Karen opened her mouth to respond. But before she could, the man across the aisle spoke again. Maybe you should check the cart, he said, his voice firm now. For a long, uncomfortable moment, Karen hesitated. Finally, with a sigh, she reached down and plucked a pair of headphones from the cart. Without a word, she placed them on Sophia's tray table and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Sophia said nothing. She simply picked up the headphones, slipping them over her ears with the precision of someone reclaiming something that had never been hers to request in the first place. The weight of the cabin shifted again, but this time, it did not rest on her shoulders. Later, as the plane dipped lower, skimming the edges of the clouds, Sophia felt a tap on her arm. The man across the aisle leaned closer, his expression apologetic but earnest. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have said something sooner. Sophia glanced at him, her eyes softening slightly. It's not your fault, she replied. I know, he said, but sometimes silence feels like agreement. And I've stayed silent for too long. Sophia offered him a small nod. Most people do, she said. They sat in silence for the rest of the descent. But something had shifted. Sophia could feel it in the air, the weight of water that had, for once, begun to tip in the other direction. The plane had settled into its cruise. That familiar pocket of quiet where the hum of the engine softened. And the passengers surrendered to the suspension of time. Sophia Carter sat still, her hands resting lightly on the arms of her seat, her gaze fixed on the clouds that stretched endlessly beneath the wing. The world outside the window was peaceful. But inside the cabin, the air crackled heavy with something unsaid. She could feel it. Karen hadn't returned since the exchange over the headphones. But her absence felt louder than her presence. The other flight attendants floated past, refilling glasses and offering warm towels. But none stopped at Sophia's row. A punishment, Sophia thought, the silent kind. She had encountered it before, the way certain people responded, not with confrontation, but with absence, a withdrawal of service. A quiet reminder that the boundaries she crossed were not forgotten. And yet, Sophia knew the price of asking for less. She had learned that shrinking oneself to make others comfortable came at a far greater cost. Karen reappeared when the meal service began. Her footsteps were slower this time, calculated, as if testing the waters. She moved down the aisle with ease, stopping to laugh with one passenger, bending low to whisper to another. But when she reached Sophia, the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. Would you care for the chicken or the pasta? Karen asked. Her tone flattened into something impersonal. The pasta, Sophia replied, keeping her voice neutral. Karen nodded, but as she placed the tray down, her hand slipped, barely perceptible, but enough for the glass of water to topple forward. It happened in slow motion. The water cascaded over the tray, spilling directly onto Sophia's lap. Oh dear, Karen said, too quickly, the corners of her mouth twitching in something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Sophia inhaled sharply through her nose. She set the tray aside and reached for the napkin, patting at the fabric of her slacks as the water seeped into the seams. Karen made no move to assist. I'll get you a towel, she said, but she lingered for a breath too long, watching, as if waiting to see how Sophia would respond. Sophia met her eyes, and for a long, silent moment, neither of them looked away. It was all there, the weight of centuries distilled into a single glance. Sophia's calm did not crack. She dabbed at her lap slowly, methodically, as if this were nothing more than an ordinary inconvenience. That would be appreciated, she said softly. Karen blinked, her expression unreadable, and walked away. The man across the aisle, the one who had spoken up earlier, shifted in his seat. I saw that, he said quietly, leaning toward her. His voice carried the hush of shared understanding. Sophia smiled faintly. "I know," she replied, folding the damp napkin on her tray. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked, genuine confusion knitting his brow. "Because it wouldn't have been for me," Sophia said, setting the tray back in place. She glanced at him, her eyes warm but firm. "It would have been for you. Or for her." He frowned, processing the weight of her words. Sophia had long understood the delicate balancing act required of her in these spaces. To demand too much was to confirm the quiet prejudices already simmering beneath the surface. To say nothing risked becoming complicit in her own erasure. The difference between the two was measured in moments. And Sophia had learned to choose hers carefully. Karen returned minutes later with a towel, handing it to Sophia with the precision of someone handing off a document they had no desire to hold. "Thank you," Sophia said, her tone soft but edged with something that made Karen's eyes flicker with discomfort. Karen hesitated. "If you need anything else," Karen said, "let me know." It was meant to sound polite, but the words carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. "I will," Sophia replied, and this time, there was no mistaking the finality in her voice. Karen turned quickly, disappearing down the aisle. The rest of the flight passed in heavy silence. Sophia remained still, her mind replaying the spill over and over again, not out of anger, but out of curiosity. It fascinated her, the way these moments played out like choreography. Each gesture rehearsed long before it was performed. Karen's actions were not loud. They were not grand or explosive. But they were deliberate. And that, Sophia thought, was the most dangerous kind of discrimination, the kind that dressed itself in the language of politeness. It did not yell. It whispered. It did not shove. It spilled water. It denied, withdrew, ignored until the weight of it pressed down hard enough to reshape the world in its image. But Sophia had long since learned that she was not made to be reshaped. She was the kind of woman who held her ground. As the plane began its descent, Sophia felt the shift in the cabin as passengers stirred, gathering their belongings and straightening their seats. Karen passed by one final time, but her eyes did not meet Sophia's. Sophia watched her, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The thing about water, she thought, is that it only spills when there's something to contain it. And Sophia Carter had spent a lifetime making sure there was nothing in her that could be contained. The plane landed with the gentlest of thuds, the kind that left most passengers blinking awake, unaware they'd already crossed back into the solid world. But Sophia Carter had not slept. She remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. Around her, the cabin stirred to life, seat belts clicking open, phones lighting up, and the muted hum of polite conversations picking up where they left off. Yet the silence that lingered between Sophia and Karen remained thick, hanging in the air like an uninvited guest. It was a silence Sophia knew well. A silence that belonged to the moments after a battle fought without raising your voice. Karen had not returned to her row since the spill. When other flight attendants had walked through the cabin, they had kept their interactions with Sophia brief, cordial, but distant. And yet, even in their absence, the memory of water pooling in her lap felt like it had left a stain. The man across the aisle, his name, she had learned, was Henry, stood and reached for his carry-on. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned toward her seat. "You know," he said, "I've flown this airline for 20 years. And I don't think I've ever seen someone treated quite like that." Sophia glanced up at him, arching a brow. "Perhaps you weren't looking," she replied gently. Henry paused, as if considering whether to let the weight of her words settle or brush them aside. "I suppose that's true," he said at last, "but I see it now." Sophia gave a soft nod of acknowledgement. "It's not the worst I've seen," she added, "but that's the thing, isn't it? It never really needs to be." Henry looked as though he wanted to say something more, but he thought better of it. He lingered a moment longer, then offered a small nod and stepped into the aisle. Karen's voice came over the intercom, cheerfully thanking passengers for flying. It was remarkable, Sophia thought, how easily one could slide back into pleasantries, smoothing over the rough edges of a confrontation like it had never happened. But Sophia knew better. She recognized that tone, the way it rose just a little too high. It was the voice of someone who believed that if they smiled long enough, they could convince the world they had done no wrong. As the plane came to a full stop, Sophia finally stood, collecting her coat and bag with deliberate care. There was no rush. Karen waited at the front of the cabin, her hands clasped before her, offering well-practiced smiles to each passenger as they disembarked. Sophia watched from the corner of her eye, noting the way Karen's posture stiffened slightly as she approached. When Sophia reached the door, she paused just long enough for Karen to notice. "Thank you for flying with us," Karen said, her smile pinned in place like a decorative brooch. Sophia tilted her head slightly, letting the pause hang between them. The moment stretched thin, fragile. Karen's smile twitched at the corners. And then Sophia did something Karen did not expect. She smiled back. Not a large smile, not one of forgiveness or warmth, but a small, knowing smile, the kind that said, "I see you. I'm sure we'll see each other again," Sophia said softly. Karen blinked, her mouth parting slightly as if she might respond. But no words came. Sophia stepped past her and into the jet bridge, the cool airport air brushing against her skin like the touch of a familiar friend. Racism, Sophia had long understood, was rarely loud. It did not always arrive with torches or slurs. Often, it wore uniforms and polite smiles. It hid in the spaces between words, in the hands that slipped, and the drinks that spilled just a little too conveniently. It was the quiet clash, the unspoken war, and Sophia had spent her life learning how to win those battles one step, one glance, one knowing smile at a time. The terminal stretched wide and open, but to Sophia Carter, it felt narrow. The lights above hummed faintly, their fluorescence flattening the colors of the airport into something pale and artificial. Travelers poured from the jet bridge, their steps hurried, their eyes fixed ahead, eager to dissolve into the next part of their journey. Sophia walked slower. Her pace wasn't out of exhaustion, no. It was the practiced calm of someone who had learned that haste often led to missteps. She had walked through too many rooms where she was expected to shrink. And slowing down was her quiet rebellion. The glass windows lining the terminal reflected back her image, tall and composed. The water stain on her slacks now dried into faint traces. But as Sophia walked, she wasn't looking at her reflection. She was watching the people behind her in the glass. Watching Karen step out from the jet bridge, smoothing her uniform, laughing lightly with a fellow attendant as if the world she inhabited was untouched. Unbothered. It was always like that, wasn't it? The offender could walk away from the moment untouched, while the offended carried the weight of it, long after the ground had settled beneath their feet. Sophia adjusted her coat over her arm as she approached the baggage claim area. Around her, first-class passengers drifted into the carousel section, each one seeming to peel off into their respective corners of privileged chauffeurs waiting with small placards. Drivers pulling up to curbside services. Sophia's driver wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. She didn't mind the wait. She had learned to find a strange peace in these pauses, the small gaps of stillness between encounters. But as she lingered near the luggage belt, she noticed Karen again. The flight attendants had gathered near the service counter. Most were occupied with wrapping up post-flight duties. But Karen's eyes landed on Sophia. It wasn't obvious. It never was. Karen wasn't foolish enough to stare. Instead, it was the brief, flickering glance of someone who hadn't quite shaken the feeling that the story wasn't finished. And Sophia knew why. Because nothing unnerved people more than the quiet aftermath of their wrongdoing. Sophia moved to a nearby cafe. Ordering tea, she waited by the glass partition, watching the steam curl from the cup. But her attention lingered elsewhere. She thought about that moment on the plane when Henry, the man across the aisle, had spoken up. "I should have said something sooner." She had heard those words too many times. The well-meaning apology of an observer who understood too late the cost of silence. And yet, even those moments, rare as they were, had a price. When white men like Henry spoke up, the response shifted. Karen's posture had stiffened because his voice carried a weight that Sophia's did not. Sophia could have said the exact same words, in the exact same tone, and still Karen would have found a way to dismiss her. But Henry had forced Karen to reconsider. Not because of the truth he spoke, but because of who was speaking. And that was the heart of it. As Sophia stirred her tea, the faint reflection of Karen appeared in the glass beside her. The flight attendant approached cautiously, her footsteps soft but deliberate. Sophia didn't turn immediately. She let Karen linger for a moment longer in that uncomfortable space, waiting. unsure of what to say. "Ms. Carter." Finally, Sophia looked up. Karen's hands twisted in front of her, the polished surface of her name tag catching the light. "I wanted to apologize for earlier," Karen said, her voice light, rehearsed, "about the headphones and the water." Sophia let the words hang. She watched Karen closely, noting the carefully measured tone, the way her eyes darted briefly to the side as if seeking an exit. It wasn't a real apology. It was a performance. Karen wasn't apologizing because she regretted what she'd done, she was apologizing because she feared what would come next. That was the difference. Sophia set her tea down carefully. She had no interest in easy forgiveness. "Is that all?" Sophia asked, tilting her head slightly. Karen hesitated. "I didn't mean for it to come across that way," she added quickly, her smile thin and fragile. Sophia's gaze didn't waver. "Of course not," Sophia replied, her voice smooth, unwavering. "It never is." The words cut through Karen's facade, stripping the moment of its pretense. Karen shifted uncomfortably, glancing over her shoulder as if hoping someone might call her away, rescue her from the confrontation she had set into motion. But no one did. And that, Sophia thought, was justice in its smallest form. Karen eventually muttered a soft goodbye and slipped away, leaving Sophia alone with her tea. The apology hadn't mattered, because in the end, Karen would forget this moment long before Sophia did. That was the nature of these things, fleeting for some, enduring for others. But as Sophia sat there, watching the terminal continue its endless rhythm, she felt no anger, only clarity, because she had long understood that Karen was not the point. The point was the system that let her exist comfortably. And Sophia had no intention of tearing down Karen. She had her sights set on something much larger. Sophia Carter wasn't the kind of woman who raised her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of her silence, when carefully applied, often did the work for her. That silence followed her as she stepped into the sleek boardroom of Carter Aviation. Her company, her name etched in silver lettering across the glass doors. The room overlooked the city skyline, sunlight pouring in like a spotlight. Inside, the board members sat, their polished shoes reflecting under the long mahogany table. James Everett, the airline's COO, greeted her with the kind of practiced smile men in power learned to wear. "Welcome back, Sophia." There was warmth in his voice. But underneath it, she detected something else: caution. They had heard. She could see it in the subtle way their gazes shifted, lingering just long enough to let her know the story had traveled ahead of her. Nothing travels faster than discomfort. The incident on the plane, Karen's missteps, the apology that wasn't, these things lived longer in corporate halls than one might expect. Not because they were unusual, but because they exposed the fractures everyone preferred to ignore. James gestured for her to sit. "We heard about the flight," he began carefully, his fingers tapping softly against the table. "I wanted to touch base directly, to make sure it was handled." Sophia met his gaze, her hands folded on the table before her. "It was handled," she replied smoothly, "but that's not why I'm here." James's brow arched slightly. Sophia allowed the silence to stretch. She let them shift in their chairs, waiting for her to continue. Finally, she leaned forward. "There's a pattern, James," she said, her voice calm, deliberate, "and it's not new." The room seemed to still. "I wasn't humiliated because of one flight attendant's poor judgment. It happened because this company, my company, allows people like her to exist comfortably. It's a culture issue." James opened his mouth to respond, but Sophia wasn't finished. "I've been in rooms like this long enough to know the excuses," she said. "You'll call it an isolated incident. You'll point to diversity reports and training sessions. But none of that changes the fact that it keeps happening." James leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. Sophia could see it in his face, the tug of war happening behind his eyes. He wanted to defend the company. He wanted to insist things weren't as broken as she claimed. But he also knew she was right. And Sophia Carter wasn't the kind of woman men could dismiss without consequence. "Let me be clear," she continued, soft but unwavering. "This isn't about the headphones or the spilled water. It's about what those things represent. The 1,000 small cuts that tell people like me, people who look like me, that no matter how high we climb, there will always be someone waiting to remind us we don't belong." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, exchanging a glance with another board member. "Karen's been let go," he offered, as if it were a peace offering. Sophia smiled faintly. That's a start, she replied. But firing one flight attendant won't fix the fact that there are hundreds more like her in this company and not all of them wear uniforms. The room fell silent again. Sophia's words cut deeper than the men around the table were ready to admit. She knew that. And yet, she pressed on. I'm not here to file a complaint, she said, her voice softening, but only slightly. I'm here to propose something else. James's eyes narrowed slightly, curiosity flickering in his gaze. I want a full audit of our employee training, Sophia said, not just the customer-facing staff, but everyone, executives included. I want anti-bias training that means something. Not a PowerPoint they forget the moment they leave the room. James's fingers drummed lightly against the table. That's a significant investment, he said carefully. It won't sit well with everyone. Sophia leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Good, she replied. Discomfort means we're doing something right. James's lips pressed into a thin line. I need to take this to the board for a vote, he said. Sophia met his gaze without blinking. I am the board, James. Her words landed like a hammer. James sat back, the weight of her position settling into his bones. Sophia rose from her seat, smoothing the line of her coat. I'll expect a proposal on my desk by the end of the week, she added, her tone gentle but brooking no argument. James nodded, his gaze following her as she walked toward the door. Thank you, Sophia, he said quietly. She paused, hand resting lightly on the doorframe. But she didn't turn around. Don't thank me yet, she replied. Not until the work is done. And with that, she stepped out of the boardroom, leaving the men inside to sit with the weight of her words. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But Sophia Carter wasn't chasing victories. She was chasing change. Sophia Carter's footsteps echoed softly down the corridor as she left the boardroom. But the weight of her presence lingered long after the door closed behind her. She had been here before in rooms like this, where the air was thick with the quiet resistance of men who had spent their lives learning how to conceal it. Power, when threatened, rarely roared. It shifted in its seat, exchanged glances, and nodded politely while planning its next move. Sophia knew this, and yet, she wasn't naive enough to believe the hardest part was over. The hardest part, the part no one ever saw, was what came after the meeting. The slow unraveling. The conversations behind closed doors where her name was spoken not as a leader, but as a problem to be solved. They would test her. She could feel it coming. The same way you feel a storm gather long before the first drop of rain hits the ground. By the time Sophia returned to her office, the city skyline was beginning to fold into dusk. The glass windows stretched from floor to ceiling, framing the soft glow of streetlights flickering on below. Her assistant, Camille, hovered near the door, holding a thin manila folder. They called, Camille said softly, stepping inside. James and the others. They're processing. Sophia smiled faintly as she slipped out of her coat. They'll process faster, she replied, settling into the leather chair behind her desk. When they realize I'm not going anywhere. Camille hesitated, then placed the folder on Sophia's desk. They're not happy about the audit, Camille added, her voice lowering slightly. I overheard a few of them talking after you left. One of them said it's unnecessary. That we're already diverse enough. Sophia didn't respond immediately. She opened the folder, scanning the contents, early drafts of the training proposal she had demanded. She knew Camille was waiting for a reaction. But Sophia wasn't surprised. Diversity was always welcome until it had a voice. There's something else, Camille said after a pause. Sophia glanced up, her brow lifting slightly. Karen, Camille added carefully, crossing her arms. She filed a complaint against you. Sophia's eyes narrowed faintly. On what grounds? Camille hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Hostile work environment, she said. She claims you targeted her. That you were retaliatory. Sophia set the folder down, folding her hands in her lap. Retaliatory. It was almost funny, the way the system twisted itself to protect those who upheld it. Karen's complaint wasn't about justice. It was about punishment. She wanted Sophia to know that even though she'd lost the battle, she still believed herself entitled to a war. Sophia leaned back in her chair, staring out at the skyline as the city's lights flickered brighter against the encroaching night. Karen's actions weren't surprising, but they were exhausting. This was the part of the fight no one liked to talk about, the slow grinding fatigue of having to justify your presence over and over again. You win the battle, and yet somehow, you find yourself standing at the same threshold the very next day. Sophia exhaled softly, feeling the weight settle into her shoulders. Do we need to escalate? Camille asked carefully. No, Sophia replied, shaking her head. Let her file her complaint. Let them investigate if they want to. Camille frowned. With all due respect, that seems, she hesitated, searching for the right word. Lenient. Sophia's gaze drifted to Camille, but her eyes were distant, thoughtful. This isn't just about Karen, she said. It's bigger than that. Camille nodded slowly, but Sophia could see the flicker of doubt in her expression. They don't see it yet, Sophia thought. That evening, as Sophia left the office, the city felt colder than it had when she arrived that morning. The wind slid between the buildings, sharp and unforgiving, the streets quieter now that rush hour had passed. Her car waited at the curb, but Sophia paused before getting in. She stood there for a moment, gazing out at the lights sprawled across the horizon. Her father had once told her that the most dangerous people weren't the ones who hated you outright. They were the ones who smiled while holding the door closed. Karen's complaint was that door one she had tried to shut quietly, without making too much noise. But Sophia had learned a long time ago how to walk through locked doors. And now, she intended to leave them wide open behind her. The next day, Sophia filed her own complaint. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it was thorough. And by the time it reached the board, it wasn't just Karen who was under scrutiny. Sophia made sure of that. There is a peculiar quiet that follows confrontation, a silence that doesn't mark peace, but the preparation for whatever comes next. Sophia Carter knew this quiet well. She sat at the head of the long oak table in the conference room, the city stretching out behind her through floor-to-ceiling windows. The room was filled, but few dared to speak. The weight of her formal complaint sat like an unwelcome guest at the table, and the men surrounding her seemed unsure whether to acknowledge it or pretend it wasn't there at all. Karen wasn't in the room. She didn't need to be. Her absence was loud enough. At the far end of the table, James Everett shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly against the polished wood. It was a subtle rhythm, but to Sophia, it echoed louder than any apology he might offer. She had been here before. Karen's complaint had forced the company's hand. An investigation, the kind that promised fairness but rarely delivered it, had been launched. Sophia had endured it with the calm of someone who had long understood that fairness wasn't the goal, survival was. But she hadn't come this far just to survive. She intended to win. James cleared his throat, leaning forward with the carefully measured expression of a man who had prepared his words long before stepping into the room. Sophia, he began, I think we can all agree the last few weeks have been difficult. Sophia's gaze didn't waver. Difficult, she repeated softly, letting the word settle. James nodded, sensing the edge in her tone. We've reviewed the details, he continued. Karen is no longer with the company. And while her actions were regrettable, we believe it's in everyone's best interest to move forward without prolonging this. There it was, the familiar call for closure. It was the same song Sophia had heard her entire life, the melody of resolution that came too soon. Before the lesson had a chance to sink in, Sophia's fingers traced the rim of the glass of water before her. Her movements slow and deliberate. I imagine it must be comforting, she said, her voice smooth, to believe that removing one person solves the problem. James shifted, but Sophia didn't let him interrupt. That's the mistake you're making, she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. You think this ends with Karen? A ripple of discomfort passed through the boardroom, subtle but undeniable. Sophia leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. Let me explain something to you, she said, her voice soft, almost intimate. Karen wasn't the problem, she was the symptom. James frowned. We understand that, Sophia. No, she cut in, her tone sharpening. You don't. The room tensed, the air tightening around them. Sophia's eyes didn't leave James, but her words were meant for everyone seated at the table. Karen didn't wake up one day and decide to treat me differently. She was trained by the culture you allowed to flourish here, Sophia said. Every polite dismissal, every promotion that passed over someone who looked like me, those moments taught her that I wasn't equal to the men sitting in this room. James's mouth opened slightly, but he hesitated. You didn't need to tell her outright, Sophia added. The silence did the talking for you. The room was still. Sophia let the pause stretch. Let the weight of her words settle into their chests, pressing down on them in the same way these moments had pressed on her for years. She thought of her father then, how he had once told her that nothing frightened people more than the truth spoken plainly. Because once it was said, it could not be unsaid. Sophia straightened in her seat, adjusting the cuff of her blazer. I filed the complaint because it was necessary. She continued, her voice softer now, but no less sharp. But I'm not interested in Karen's apology. Nor am I here to collect yours. James's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. What do you want, Sophia? He asked, his tone lowering into something more cautious. Sophia met his gaze head on. I want the door, she said. James blinked. The door? She nodded. I want the door that's been closed to people like me for too long. She said plainly. I want the policies rewritten. I want training that isn't a box you check once a year. And I want to sit across from you not as someone you have to tolerate but as someone you answer to. A hush fell over the room. James glanced at the others, searching for some form of consensus. But none of them spoke. Sophia smiled faintly. Power has a way of recognizing itself. And James, for all his resistance, knew when he had been bested. Finally, he nodded, the reluctance in his posture softening into something that resembled resignation. I'll have the committee draft new protocols by next quarter, he said quietly. You'll be involved in every step. Sophia leaned back in her chair, satisfaction flickering beneath the calm surface of her expression. Good, she replied. I'll hold you to that. As the meeting adjourned, the board members filed out one by one, their eyes lingering on Sophia a moment longer than necessary. James was the last to leave, pausing at the door. You know, he said carefully, some people might say you're pushing too hard. Sophia smiled faintly. They always do, she replied. And with that, James stepped out, leaving Sophia alone in the quiet. She didn't move immediately. Instead, she gazed out at the skyline, watching as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the city she had spent her life navigating. There would be more Karens. There always were. But now, Sophia held the door open. And that was how you began to change the shape of the world 1 inch at a time.